The fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows across the weathered walls of the cabin. Outside, winter pressed against the windows with December cold that made the glass weep. Inside, warmth. Inside, a story waiting to be told. Caleb Stone sat in his old chair, the leather cracked from 40 years of use. 70 years had carved lines deep into his face, lines that spoke of weather and wind and choices that left permanent marks on a man's soul. His grandson Michael sat across from him, 16 years old, and full of questions, the way young men always are when they sense the weight of untold history. The boy had been staring out the window for the past 10 minutes, his gaze fixed on three cairns of stone that stood like sentinels in the snow. Three graves, two with names carved into cedar crosses, one without. Michael turned from the window. "Grandpa, who's buried in those three graves, and why doesn't the third one have a name?" Caleb closed his eyes. 70 years old and some memories still cut like fresh wounds. But the boy deserved to know, deserved to understand that family doesn't always come from blood, that mercy isn't weakness, that sometimes a man has to choose between surviving and living. "Michael," Caleb said, his voice the low rumble of distant thunder, "there are three things I learned from this mountain. First, mercy isn't weakness. Sometimes it's the hardest choice a man can make. Second, a man isn't measured by what he has, but by what he's willing to give up. Third, family doesn't always come from blood. Sometimes it comes from the choices we make in darkness." He opened his eyes and looked at his grandson. Really looked at him. Saw himself at that age before war, before loss, before the winter that changed everything. Those three graves tell a story. The story of the winter of 1870. I was 40 years old. I thought my life was over. I'd been dead inside for 5 years, just waiting for the courage to lie down in that third grave I dug for myself. Then the world sent me a 19-year-old nun, a 10-year-old boy, and a choice. Keep dying slow in solitude, or live again by saving others. The firelight dimmed as if in response to his words. Caleb's voice changed, deepened, became the voice of a younger man. It started with a bear. The year was 1870, and in the hills of Kentucky, winter came down like a hammer. 2 feet of snow lay thick across Ironwood Mountain, turning the world into a vast white silence, broken only by the occasional crack of frozen branches. Through this frozen wilderness, a figure moved with the careful patience of a predator who knows these woods better than most men know their own homes. Caleb Stone stood 6'3" in his worn leather boots, 210 pounds of muscle and sinew wrapped in buckskin and fur. His beard, black as coal and thick as winter moss, hung down to his chest. It had never known the touch of scissors. His hair fell past his shoulders, bound with a strip of rawhide to keep it from his eyes. Those eyes, dark brown and sharp as a hawk's, tracked the massive paw prints in the snow before him. A grizzly bear, 400 pounds if it was an ounce. The tracks were fresh, no more than an hour old, the edges still crisp where the great claws had torn into the frozen earth beneath the snow. Caleb carried his Winchester rifle in scarred hands, hands that looked like they'd been carved from oak and left in the weather for decades. A scar ran diagonal across his left eye, white against his sun-darkened skin. The gift of a mountain lion that had learned too late that Caleb Stone was not easy prey. The tracks led up a steep ridge through a stand of pine trees, so old they'd watched the last of the Cherokee pass through these mountains. Caleb followed his breath, making clouds in the frigid air. He made no more sound than the falling snow. Ahead through the trees he caught movement. The bear had stopped to dig at something, its massive shoulders working as it tore at the frozen ground. Caleb raised the Winchester, his finger resting light on the trigger. The model, 1866, 44 rimfire cartridges. He'd carried this rifle through the war, through 15 years of mountain solitude. It had never failed him. The bear was broadside, an easy shot, 30 yards across snow and pine needles. Caleb could almost feel the weight of 400 pounds of meat, enough to last through the hardest part of winter. His finger touched the trigger, but he didn't squeeze. Instead, he watched. The bear wasn't hunting. It was digging at the roots of an old oak, looking for grubs and insects frozen in their winter sleep. It was hungry like everything else in these mountains in December, but it wasn't starving. It would live to see spring. Caleb lowered the rifle. He'd killed his share of bears, more than his share probably. But he'd learned long ago that not every killing was necessary. Some things deserve to live simply because they were trying to live. He raised his head and let out a roar that would have done credit to the bear itself. The grizzly's head snapped up. Its eyes found Caleb instantly across the white expanse. For a long moment, man and beast regarded each other. Two predators, two survivors. Then the bear turned and lumbered away into the deeper woods, moving with surprising speed for something so large. Caleb watched it go. Then he turned back toward home. His cabin sat another 2 miles up the mountain, tucked into a hollow where three ridges came together like the fingers of a grasping hand. He'd built it himself 15 years ago when he was 25 and newly married. Back when the world had seemed like a place where a man could carve out something good if he worked hard enough and kept his head down. The cabin was small, just one room with a sleeping loft he'd never finished. Built from pine logs he'd felled and stripped himself. Chinked with mud and moss. Roofed with split shingles. It wasn't much to look at, but it had a stone fireplace that drew well, keeping the single room warm, even when the wind screamed down from the peaks. And it had 3 graves beside it. He saw them as he approached through the last stand of trees. 3 mounds of stones carefully placed and maintained. 2 topped with wooden crosses he'd carved from cedar. 1 empty waiting. The graves of Mary Stone and Jacob Stone, his wife and his son, taken from him by scarlet fever 5 winters past. Mary had been 35 when she died, still beautiful despite the hard life of the mountains. Jacob had been 8 with his mother's smile and his father's stubborn chin. Caleb stopped at the graves like he did every morning, like he would do every morning until they laid him in the ground beside them. He'd picked wildflowers and summer pine boughs in winter. Today he had nothing but his presence, so he gave them that. He stood for 5 full minutes in the falling snow, not praying exactly because he'd lost his faith somewhere in the fever dreams of watching them die, but remembering the sound of Mary's laugh, remembering the way Jacob would run to meet him when he came home from hunting, remembering what it felt like to be something other than alone. The memories came whether he wanted them or not. March of 1865, 5 years ago, but it felt like yesterday. The fever had come in the night. Jacob first, his small body burning with heat that turned his skin red as fire. Mary had nursed him without rest, without sleep, pouring water down his throat, bathing him with cool cloths. Then Mary caught it. For 72 hours, Caleb had sat between them, wiping fevered brows, praying to a God he wasn't sure was listening, making bargains he knew he couldn't keep. Take me instead. Let them live and take me. Jacob died on the 2nd morning. Mary died at noon on the 3rd day, her hand reaching for her sons even in death. Caleb had dug the 2 graves in March snow, the ground frozen harder than stone. Each swing of the pickaxe felt like a blade through his chest. When he finished the 2nd grave, he'd started on a 3rd, for himself. Because what was the point of living when everything worth living for was gone, but he'd never had the courage to lie down in it. 5 years of existing but not living. Eating to not die, sleeping to not go mad, moving between cabin and graves like a pendulum, marking time until time stopped mattering. Then because standing in the snow, dwelling on ghosts was a good way to join them, he turned toward the cabin. Inside the cabin was warm and dim, lit only by the glow from the fireplace and the weak winter light coming through the single small window. The room smelled of wood smoke and cured meat and the particular mustiness that comes from a man living alone. His bed stood against one wall, a simple frame with a rope mattress and wool blankets. A table and 2 chairs occupied the center of the room, though he only ever used 1 chair now. The second had been Mary's. He couldn't bring himself to sit in it or to burn it for firewood. So it just sat there gathering dust, a monument to absence. He hung his rifle on wooden pegs above the door and shrugged out of his heavy coat. Beneath it he wore a wool shirt that had been red once but had faded to dusty pink. His arms exposed when he rolled up the sleeves to tend the fire were thick with muscle and marked with scars. A man didn't live alone in the mountains for 15 years without collecting scars. He rekindled the fire and put a pot of water on to boil. Then he checked his stores. Salt, maybe a week's worth left. Not enough to cure meat if he brought down a deer. Ammunition, down to 15 rounds for the Winchester and maybe 20 for his Colt revolver. He hadn't been to town in 6 months. Not since last summer when he'd gone down to sell furs and buy supplies. He hated going to town, hated the noise, the crowds, the way people looked at him like he was some kind of wild thing that had wandered down from the high country. But necessity was necessity, and he was out of salt. He ate a cold breakfast of cornbread and salt pork, then went back outside to prepare for the journey. His horse, a sturdy Tennessee Walker mare named Ash, waited in the small lean-to he'd built behind the cabin. She was black as her name suggested, 8 years old, calm and reliable as the sunrise. He'd raised her from a foal, and she was probably the closest thing he had to a friend these days. He saddled her, carefully checking every strap and buckle. The trip down to Ashford would take 3 hours through snow and ice. The last thing he needed was to have a saddle slip on a steep grade. He filled his canteen from the barrel of water by the door, made sure his knife was secure in its sheath at his belt, checked the Colt at his hip. The Navy 1851. He'd carried it through the war. It had saved his life more times than he could count. Then he climbed into the saddle. Ash snorted once, her breath steaming in the cold air. Then she started down the mountain trail without needing to be urged. The path down was treacherous, winding between rock outcroppings and stands of timber, crossing half-frozen streams and skirting ledges where a misstep would mean 100-foot fall onto stones and shattered trees. Caleb let Ash pick her own way, trusting her mountain sense more than his own sometimes. They'd been making this journey together for 8 years. She knew every rock, every dangerous spot, every place where the trail narrowed to barely wider than her shoulders. About an hour down, they met another traveler coming up. Old Henry Cooper driving a wagon loaded with split firewood. His ancient mule plodding along with the resigned patience of an animal that had long ago given up expecting life to get any easier. Henry was somewhere north of 60, with a beard even longer than Caleb's, though his was white as the snow around them. He pulled his wagon to a stop when he saw Caleb raising one gnarled hand in greeting. Caleb stopped Ash beside the wagon. He and Henry weren't exactly friends, but they had the kind of relationship mountain men often had, built on mutual respect and very few words. Henry looked up at him with eyes that had seen more winters than Caleb had been alive. His voice when he spoke was rough as tree bark. "Caleb Stone. Been a while." Caleb nodded. "Henry, wood's selling well. Well enough for folks who got money. Times are hard since the war ended." They sat in silence for a moment, two men who understood that not every silence needed to be filled. Then Henry shifted on his seat, and his face took on an expression Caleb couldn't quite read, something between disgust and resignation. "You headed down to Ashford?" Henry asked. Caleb nodded again. "Need salt and ammunition." Henry spat over the side of his wagon, a long brown stream of tobacco juice that steamed when it hit the snow. "You might want to think twice about going today." "Why is that?" Henry's jaw worked on his chew for a moment before he answered. "They're selling sinners down at the old tobacco warehouse. That's what they call it anyway. Redemption House is running another one of their auctions." Caleb felt something cold settle in his chest that had nothing to do with the winter air. "What kind of auction?" "The kind where they sell young women like they was livestock. Girls from that convent up in Nashville that burned down. They're calling it redemption. Saying these girls need to work off their sins, but everybody knows it's just slavery dressed up in church clothes." Henry paused, his eyes studying Caleb's face. "Had one last month too. Sold 4 girls to miners and farmers. Lord knows what happened to them after." Caleb's hands tightened on the reins. Ash shifted beneath him, sensing his tension. "How many girls?" Caleb asked, his voice carefully neutral. Henry shrugged. "Heard tell they got 9 from the convent. Sold 8 already. Got 1 left today. Last one, they say. After that, Redemption House is moving on to Tennessee or Virginia or someplace else where the law ain't caught up with them yet." They sat in silence again, but this time it wasn't comfortable. The wind moved through the pines, making them whisper secrets to each other. Somewhere far off, a crow called harsh and lonely. "I ain't telling you what to do," Henry said finally, "but I seen your face, Caleb Stone, and I know that look. Just remember, Silas Garrett runs Redemption House, and he's got the local law in his pocket. Sheriff Barton won't lift a finger to help if you cause trouble. And Garrett's got men, hard men who don't mind hurting folks." Caleb looked down at the old man. "Appreciate the warning." Henry studied him for a long moment, then shook his head slowly. "You're going anyway, ain't you?" Caleb didn't answer. He touched the brim of his hat, urged Ash forward, and continued down the mountain. Behind him, he heard Henry spit again and mutter something that might have been a prayer or might have been a curse. The words followed Caleb down the trail like ghosts. "They're selling sinners. Girls from the convent. Last one today." The memories came uninvited the way they always did when he thought about people being bought and sold. He was 12 years old again, standing in the yard of his father's failing farm in the valley below these very mountains. His father, a hard man made harder by poverty, and whiskey had been in debt to the owner of the coal mine down in the valley. $300, an impossible sum. The mine owner had offered a solution. He'd take Caleb as payment, $50 against the debt. A boy to work in the mines, to crawl through spaces too small for grown men, to breathe coal dust and darkness for 12 hours a day. His father had taken the deal without even looking at him. Caleb had worked in those mines for 3 years. 3 years of darkness and danger. Of watching boys younger than him die in cave-ins and explosions. Of eating slop that wouldn't be fit for pigs and sleeping in a bunkhouse where the cold came up through the floor and the rats were bold enough to bite. The foreman had been a man named Wesley Garrett. He'd beaten the children for discipline, he said, to make men out of weak boys. Caleb still had scars on his back from Wesley's belt. At 15, Caleb had escaped during a thunderstorm, running through the woods while the mine guards searched for him with dogs and guns. He'd made it to these mountains and never come down again. Not for years. He taught himself to hunt, to trap, to survive on nothing but what the land provided. And he'd sworn in those early years of freedom that he would never stand by and watch another human being be bought and sold. Not if he could stop it. For 15 years, he'd kept that oath by staying isolated. Can't witness what you don't see. Can't be forced to choose if you avoid all choices. But today, going down to town for salt, that oath collided with reality. When I was 12 years old, I needed someone to help me. Nobody did. I won't be nobody. Not anymore. The town of Ashford sat in a valley where three creeks came together. A collection of rough wooden buildings that had sprung up around the coal mines and the timber operations. Maybe 800 people called it home. Most of them miners or their families, along with the usual assortment of merchants and saloon keepers and those who made their living off the hard work of others. It was an ugly town, Caleb thought. All mud and coal dust and the smell of too many people living too close together. He'd never understood why folks wanted to live like this, all crowded in on each other when there were mountains full of clean air and solitude just a few hours right away. But people were strange creatures, and their choices weren't his to judge. He rode Ash down the main street, which wasn't much more than a wide dirt track churned to frozen mud by wagon wheels and foot traffic. The few people he passed gave him a wide berth. He was used to that. He was a big man, bigger than most, and he looked like exactly what he was. Something wild that had wandered down from the high places. Children stared at him with wide eyes. Women pulled their shawls tighter and hurried past. Men gave him hard looks but didn't meet his eyes for long. At the general store, he tied Ash to the hitching rail and went inside. The store was warm heated by a pot-bellied stove in the center of the room. It smelled of coffee and tobacco and the particular mixture of goods that all general stores seem to smell of. Mallister, the owner, was behind the counter, a thin man with thinning hair and spectacles perched on his nose. He looked up when Caleb entered, and his expression went from neutral to weary. "Caleb Stone," Mallister said. "It's been a while." Caleb nodded, moving to the counter. "Need 10 pounds of salt and 100 rounds of .44 rimfire." Mallister started gathering the items without comment. He was one of the few people in town who didn't try to make conversation with Caleb, which was one of the reasons Caleb did business with him. But today Mallister seemed nervous, his movements jerky, his eyes darting to the door and back. When he set the wrapped package of salt on the counter, he leaned in close and lowered his voice. "You should get what you need and head back up the mountain, Caleb. Today's not a good day to be in town." "So I heard," Caleb said. "Henry told me about the auction." Mallister's face tightened. "It's an evil thing what they're doing, but Sheriff Barton says it's legal, and most folks are too scared of Silas Garrett to speak against it. The girl they got today, she's just a child, really. Can't be more than 19 or 20. Been kept in that warehouse for 2 days without food from what I hear. They're saying she's the last one, and then Redemption House is moving on. Good riddance, I say, but that doesn't help the poor girl locked up right now." Caleb said nothing. He paid for his supplies, counting out coins he'd earned selling furs and hides. $4.25. Nearly a week's worth of trapping. As he turned to leave, he heard it. A woman's voice, distant but clear, carrying through the cold air from somewhere down the street. A single word repeated over and over. No, no, no. The sound cut through him like a knife. It was the sound of desperation, of someone who'd been pushed past fear into something darker and more final. Caleb stopped in the doorway of the general store, his hand on the frame. Mallister was saying something behind him. Some warning, probably. But Caleb didn't hear it. He was 12 years old again, standing in his father's yard, wanting to scream no, but not daring to because he knew it wouldn't matter. Except this time he wasn't 12. This time he could do something about it. He left his supplies on the counter and walked back out into the cold. The tobacco warehouse where Redemption House conducted its business stood about 200 yards down the street. A large wooden structure that had been built to store tobacco during harvest season, but now stood mostly empty since the war had destroyed the tobacco market. The voice was coming from there. Caleb walked toward it, his hand dropping to the Colt revolver at his hip. Not drawing it, but just resting there, feeling the familiar weight and shape. People were gathering outside the warehouse, drawn by the sound of the woman's voice, but no one was doing anything. They just stood and watched, the way people always seem to watch when something terrible is happening, too afraid or too compliant to intervene. Caleb pushed through the small crowd to the warehouse door. It wasn't locked. Inside the warehouse was dim and cold, lit only by a few oil lamps hanging from the rafters. The space was mostly empty except for some old crates and barrels stacked against one wall. In the center of the floor, three men were trying to drag a young woman toward a wagon that waited by the loading dock. The woman was fighting them with everything she had. She wore what had once been a nun's habit, though it was torn and filthy now. Her hair, what Caleb could see of it, was copper red, cut short in the style of religious sisters. Her face was pale except for a purple bruise on her left cheek and angry red marks on her wrists where rough rope had rubbed her skin raw. She couldn't have weighed more than 90 pounds, and she was fighting three men who together probably weighed 600. One of the men, a tall fellow with a thin mustache and expensive clothes that marked him as someone important, had her by the arm and was trying to twist it behind her back. Another man, shorter and heavyset, had grabbed her other arm. The third man, the largest of the three, was trying to get a grip on her legs, which she was using to kick at anything within reach. Caleb didn't announce himself, didn't call out a warning or ask what was happening. He simply walked up behind the tall man with the mustache, grabbed him by the shoulder, spun him around and hit him once. Hard. Right on the point of his jaw. It was a punch that had 200 pounds of mountain muscle behind it. It lifted the tall man off his feet and sent him sprawling backward into a stack of crates. The other two men froze suddenly, realizing there was someone else in the warehouse. The woman took advantage of their distraction. She yanked her arm free from the heavy-set man and drove her elbow into his stomach with surprising force. He doubled over, wheezing. The large man released her legs and stepped back, his hand moving towards something at his belt. A knife, Caleb saw. Caleb drew his Colt with a speed that came from years of practice. The revolver cleared leather and came level with the large man's chest in less than a second. The man froze his hand halfway to his knife. "I wouldn't," Caleb said. His voice was quiet, but it carried in the cold warehouse. The large man looked at the gun, then at Caleb's face, then slowly moved his hand away from the knife. The heavy-set man was still trying to catch his breath. The tall man with the mustache was groaning and trying to sit up, blood running from his split lip. The young woman had backed away from all of them, pressing herself against the wall, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. Now that Caleb could see her properly, he realized she was even younger than he'd thought. 19 at most, maybe younger. Her eyes wide and green as spring leaves darted between Caleb and the three men trying to understand what had just happened. The tall man finally managed to get to his feet, one hand pressed to his jaw. He looked at Caleb with eyes full of outrage and something else. Fear, maybe, though he was trying to hide it. "Do you know who I am?" The tall man demanded, his words slightly slurred from his split lip. "Do you know who you just struck?" Caleb looked at him with the same expression he might use when studying a snake he'd found in his cabin. "Don't know and don't care. Let the girl go." The tall man's face flushed red. "I'm Preston Wakefield. My father owns half the coal mines in this county. This girl is property of Redemption House, legally purchased and paid for. You've just assaulted me and interfered with legitimate business." Caleb's expression didn't change. "Buying people stopped being legitimate business when we fought a war over it." "This is different," Preston snapped. "These are sinners, fallen women who need redemption. Redemption House provides that redemption through honest work and Christian guidance." Caleb looked past Preston at the young woman. She looked back at him, and he saw intelligence in those green eyes, along with exhaustion and fear, and a stubborn kind of courage that reminded him of a fox he'd once seen caught in a trap, still fighting even though it knew it was probably going to die. "You feel like a sinner, miss?" he asked her. Her voice when she spoke surprised him. It was clear and strong despite the situation, marked with an Irish lilt that spoke of immigrant parents, or perhaps being born in Ireland itself. "I was a novice at St. Mary's Convent in Nashville. We took in orphans and taught children to read. Then these men burned our convent, killed our Mother Superior, and kidnapped 9 of us. They've sold 8 of my sisters already. I'm the last. I don't know what sin that is, but it's not mine." The conviction in her voice, the absolute clarity of it, hit Caleb harder than he'd expected. Preston started to speak, probably to argue, but Caleb cut him off with a gesture of the Colt. "Get out," he said, "all 3 of you. Now." Preston's mouth opened and closed. "You can't just demand I leave. I have legal documents. I have rights. Silas Garrett will have the law on you before sundown." Caleb took one step forward. It was amazing how much meaning could be packed into a single step when you were 6'3" and holding a gun. Preston took 2 steps back. So did the other 2 men. "Get out," Caleb repeated. They went. Preston was still protesting as he reached the door, still threatening legal action and consequences. But he went. The other 2 followed him. And then Caleb and the young woman were alone in the warehouse. The silence felt heavy after all the shouting and struggling. Caleb kept the Colt out but lowered it, not wanting to point it anywhere near the girl. She was still pressed against the wall, watching him with those intelligent green eyes. Up close, he could see that she was shivering. Whether from cold or shock or both, he couldn't tell. Her wrists were raw and bleeding where the ropes had cut into them. Her feet were bare, he realized, on the frozen floor of the warehouse. She'd been dragged here without even being given shoes. Slowly, so as not to startle her, Caleb holstered the Colt. Then he shrugged out of his heavy coat and held it out toward her. She didn't move, didn't reach for the coat, just kept watching him with those wary eyes. He understood. She'd just been rescued by a large-armed stranger who looked like he might eat raw meat for breakfast. For all she knew, he was just a different kind of danger than the 3 men who'd been trying to drag her to that wagon. "My name is Caleb Stone," he said quietly. "I live up on Ironwood Mountain. I'm not going to hurt you, miss. But you're cold and you're hurt, and this coat will help with at least one of those things." She studied him for another long moment, then slowly reached out and took the coat. It was far too large for her, hanging nearly to the floor. But it was thick and lined with fur and still warm from his body heat. She pulled it around herself with something like desperation, her thin fingers clutching the collar close to her throat. "Why did you help me?" she asked. Her voice was quieter now, almost a whisper. "You don't know me." Caleb was quiet for a moment, thinking about how to answer that. "Because no one should be chained up and sold like an animal," he said finally, "no matter what someone calls it." Her eyes searched his face, looking for something. The lie maybe, or the trick, or the real reason. Whatever she was looking for, she seemed to at least partially find it, because some of the tension went out of her shoulders. "They told us we were sinners," she said, "that we needed to be redeemed through servitude, that it was God's will. But God wouldn't want this, would he?" Caleb had stopped believing in God the day he buried his wife and son, but he wasn't about to tell this girl that. "I don't know what God wants," he said, "but I know what's right, and this isn't it." She took a shaky breath. For a moment he thought she might cry, but she didn't. Instead, she straightened her back and lifted her chin, and he saw the steel under the exhaustion. "My name is Ruth Brennan," she said. "Sister Ruth, they called me at the convent. But I suppose I'm not a sister anymore. Just Ruth." "Ruth, then," Caleb said. "Can you walk?" She looked down at her bare bleeding feet, then back up at him. "I can walk. I've walked worse." He believed her. There was something in her eyes that said she'd survived things that would have broken softer people. We need to get you out of here before those men come back with reinforcements. Are you hurt anywhere else besides your wrists and feet? Just bruises, she said. Nothing that won't heal. Caleb nodded and started toward the door. Ruth followed, limping slightly, but keeping up. When they reached the door, he stopped and looked out carefully. The small crowd that had gathered was dispersing now that the interesting part seemed to be over. No sign of Preston Wakefield or his two companions, but that wouldn't last long. They stepped out into the cold, and Caleb led the way back toward the general store. People stared at them as they passed. The huge mountain man and the tiny young woman swimming in his coat. Caleb ignored the stares. He'd been ignored and stared at for most of his life. He was used to it. At the general store, Mallister took one look at them and immediately went to his back room, returning with a blanket and a pair of women's shoes that looked like they might have belonged to his wife. For the girl, Mallister said, holding them out, can't have her walking around barefoot in December. Ruth took the shoes gratefully. They were too big, but they were better than nothing. She sat down on a chair Mallister provided and put them on with hands that shook slightly. Mallister disappeared again and came back with bread and cheese and a cup of water. The girl fell on the food like someone who hadn't eaten in days, which she probably hadn't. Caleb had seen that kind of hunger before in the mining camps when he was a boy. The hunger that comes from being deliberately starved, used as one more method of breaking someone's will. Slow down, he said gently. You eat too fast and you'll make yourself sick. She tried to slow down, but her body wasn't listening. She tore into the bread and cheese, washing it down with gulps of water. When she was done, she sat back in the chair and closed her eyes for a moment. A little color had come back into her cheeks. Thank you, she said to Mallister. And to you, she added, looking at Caleb. I don't know how to repay. You don't need repaying, Caleb said. Then to Mallister, can you do me a favor? Get word to Sheriff Jack Thornton over in Lexington. Tell him Caleb Stone needs his help. Tell him it's about Redemption House. Mallister nodded. Thornton will come. He's a good man, not like Barton, but it'll take time. He's 2 days' ride from here. Tell him to come as fast as he can, Caleb said. Then he looked at Ruth. Can you ride a horse? I grew up on a farm in County Cork before we came to America, she said. I can ride. Good. We're leaving now before Preston Wakefield comes back with whatever passes for law in this town. They left the general store, Caleb carrying his supplies and Ruth wearing Mallister's wife's 2 large shoes and Caleb's enormous coat. The sun was already starting to sink toward the western peaks. They had maybe 3 hours of daylight left. Not nearly enough to make it back to his cabin, but enough to get well away from Ashford. He untied Ash from the hitching rail and helped Ruth up into the saddle. She settled herself with the ease of someone who'd told the truth about knowing how to ride. Caleb swung up behind her and they started back the way he'd come that morning. Behind them, Ashford receded into the gathering dusk and Caleb didn't look back. But as they left the edge of town, he saw movement in an alley. Preston Wakefield talking urgently with a group of rough-looking men. They were organizing. The hunt was starting. The fire in the cabin popped, sending sparks up the chimney. Michael leaned forward in his chair, completely absorbed in the story. So you just punched him? Just like that. One punch. Caleb smiled. A deep rumbling sound. Never underestimate the power of a good punch at the right moment, Michael. But yes, just one. The man's name was Preston Wakefield, son of a man who owned half the coal mines in the county. And that punch, it made me hunted until the next morning. He paused, his eyes distant with memory. But before we get to that, you need to understand something. Violence is never the first choice. But when you see injustice happening and you have the strength to stop it, silence is complicity. Sometimes a man has to throw a punch and accept the consequences. Now listen close, because what happened next, that's when things got complicated. Michael couldn't sit still. He stood from his chair and paced to the window, looking out at the 3 graves covered in snow. You punched him. Just one punch, and then what? They just let you leave. Caleb's laugh was deep rumbling from somewhere in his chest, a sound that held both humor and the memory of violence. Michael, never underestimate the power of a good punch delivered at the right moment. But no, they didn't just let me leave. Preston Wakefield was the kind of man who'd never been hit in his life. Never been told no. His father owned half the coal mines in the county, and that meant Preston thought he owned everything else. That punch, it made me hunted for the next 36 hours. The old man shifted in his chair, the leather creaking. His eyes grew distant, seeing not the warm cabin, but a frozen mountainside lit only by stars and the flicker of distant lanterns. But there's a lesson here, and you need to hear it before I go on. Violence isn't the first choice. It shouldn't be. But when you witness evil happening right in front of you and you have the strength to stop it, silence becomes the same as approval. Sometimes a man has to act knowing the consequences will come. Sometimes doing right means doing hard. He looked at Michael, and the boy saw something in his grandfather's eyes that made him understand this wasn't just a story, it was a teaching. That day I chose. I could have walked past that warehouse, could have bought my salt and gone home and told myself it wasn't my problem. But I'd made a promise to myself when I was 12 years old. Never again. Never stand by while someone is bought and sold. So I threw that punch and I took Ruth out of that town, and then I spent the next day and night keeping her alive while men with guns hunted us through the mountains. Caleb settled back into his chair. Now listen close, because this is where the story gets complicated. Where I learned that one rescued girl was just the beginning. That evil doesn't come alone. It brings friends. The mountain trail was harder to navigate with two people on one horse, even a strong horse like Ash. They moved slowly, carefully, Caleb letting the mare pick her way over the icy patches and around the dangerous spots. Ruth sat silent in front of him, so still he might have thought she'd fallen asleep, except for the tension he could feel in her shoulders. The cold was deepening as the sun dropped toward the peaks. Already the temperature was falling toward 10 degrees, maybe lower. After about an hour as they were passing through a thick stand of pines, Ruth finally spoke. "Why did you really help me? The truth this time." Caleb thought about his answer for a while. The trail was steep here, requiring his concentration. But her question deserved more than a quick reply. "When I was 12 years old," he said finally, "my father sold me to a coal mine owner. $50 against a debt. I worked in those mines for 3 years. Came out at 15, looking like I was 30 and feeling like I was 100. Took me years to stop flinching when I heard a loud noise, because in the mines, loud noises usually meant the ceiling was coming down and you were about to die." He paused, guiding Ash around a patch of ice that gleamed in the fading light. "So when I see someone being bought and sold, I remember being 12 and wanting anyone to step in and say it was wrong. No one did, but maybe I can." He felt her relax slightly, settling back against him, just a fraction. "I'm sorry that happened to you," she said quietly. "And I'm sorry for what happened to you." They rode in silence after that, but it was a different kind of silence. The kind that comes when two people have shared something true about themselves and found understanding in it. As the sun touched the peaks and turned the snow golden orange, as the temperature dropped and their breath made clouds in the air, they climbed higher into the mountains, leaving the world of buying and selling behind them. At least for now. Darkness fell fast in the mountains during December, dropping like a curtain across the narrow valleys and steep ridges. Caleb had known they wouldn't make it back to his cabin before nightfall, but he'd hoped to get farther than they had. The trail became treacherous once the sun disappeared, shadows pooling in places where ice lurked, waiting to send horse and riders tumbling down into ravines where no one would find them until spring. When they reached a small clearing beside a frozen creek, Caleb made the decision to stop for the night. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do. He helped Ruth down from the saddle first, then dismounted himself. His legs were stiff from the cold and from sitting in one position for so long. Ruth immediately wrapped her arms around herself, shivering despite the heavy coat. The temperature was dropping fast now, probably down to 10 degrees already, and heading lower. They needed shelter, and they needed fire, and they needed both quickly. "There's a rock overhang about 50 yards up the creek," Caleb said, his breath making clouds in the air. "Used to camp there when I was younger. Not much, but it'll keep the wind off and reflect the heat from a fire." "Can you walk?" Ruth nodded, though her teeth were chattering. "I can walk." He took Ash's reins and led the way upstream, following a path he hadn't walked in years, but still remembered. The rock overhang was where he'd left it, a shelf of limestone that jutted out about 8 feet, creating a space underneath that was maybe 10 feet deep and 12 feet wide. Not quite a cave, but close enough. The ground underneath was relatively dry, covered in old pine needles and the remains of fires from years past. Someone else had used this spot too, probably trappers or hunters passing through. Caleb tied Ash to a nearby pine where she'd have some shelter from the wind, then set about making camp. He'd done this 1,000 times, could do it half asleep or sick or injured. First, the fire. He gathered deadfall from under the pines, where it had stayed relatively dry, breaking branches into manageable sizes. Ruth watched him work, still shivering, still wrapped in his coat. When he had enough wood, he used his knife to shave fine curls of wood from a piece of pine, creating tinder that would catch from a spark. His fire-starting kit was in his pack, a small tin containing charcloth, flint, and steel. Within minutes, he had a small flame going, feeding it carefully until it grew strong enough to accept larger pieces of wood. The fire transformed the space under the overhang. The flickering orange light pushed back the darkness and the cold reflecting off the limestone above them and creating a pocket of warmth in the frozen night. Caleb added more wood until the fire was burning hot and steady, then turned his attention to making the camp more comfortable. He spread his bedroll near the fire, not too close, then gestured for Ruth to sit. She did, sinking down onto the blankets with a small sound that might have been relief or exhaustion or both. Up close in the firelight, Caleb could see just how young she really was. 19, she'd said, but she looked younger. Her face all sharp angles and shadowed hollows from too many days without enough food. The bruise on her cheek was darker now, purple spreading toward black. And there were other bruises on her throat that he hadn't noticed before. Fingerprints, he realized, where someone had grabbed her hard enough to leave marks. The sight made something cold and angry settle in his chest. He retrieved his canteen and the supplies he'd bought that morning from his pack. The salt pork and cornbread he'd brought it for the journey would have to serve as dinner. He handed Ruth a piece of the cornbread and some of the dried meat. She took it, but didn't eat right away, just held it in her hands and stared at the fire. "You should eat," Caleb said. "It's not much, but it'll give you strength." "I know," she said quietly. "It's just strange. This morning I thought I was going to be sold to some miner or farmer who'd use me however he wanted. Tonight I'm sitting by a fire in the mountains with a man who asks if I can walk instead of just dragging me where he wants me to go. It doesn't feel real." Caleb settled himself on the other side of the fire, giving her space, not wanting to crowd her. "It's real," he said. "You're safe, at least for now." She looked up at him, then her green eyes reflecting the firelight. "For now," she repeated, "but not forever. They'll come looking for me. Redemption House won't just let me go. They paid for me. $300. I heard Silas Garrett say that's a lot of money to just write off." Caleb nodded. He'd been thinking the same thing. "You're right. They'll come, probably tomorrow or the day after, which is why we need to get you somewhere safe and get the law involved. Real law, not whatever Sheriff Barton represents." Ruth's voice carried something bitter. "Real law. The law says we owe Redemption House 7 years of service to redeem our sins. The law says we signed contracts. Never mind that we were locked in a room and told to sign papers we weren't allowed to read or that they'd kill us if we refused. The law doesn't care about that part." It was a fair point, and Caleb didn't have a good answer for it. Instead, he changed the subject slightly. "Tell me about the convent, about what happened." Ruth was quiet for a long moment, and Caleb thought she might refuse. Then she started talking, her voice low and steady, staring into the fire as she spoke. "St. Mary's was a small convent in Nashville. We took in orphans, mostly Irish children, whose parents had died on the journey to America or died from disease after they arrived. We taught them to read and write, gave them a safe place to grow up." She paused, and Caleb saw her hands tighten on the cornbread she still hadn't eaten. "I came there when I was 5 after my parents died of cholera. Mother Superior Catherine took me in and raised me like her own daughter. When I was 15, I began my novitiate. I thought I'd spend my life there teaching children, living quietly. It seemed like a good life." Her voice caught slightly, and she had to clear her throat before continuing. "Then 3 months ago in September, men came in the night. They said there had been complaints about the convent that we were harboring runaway slaves, which was a lie. They set fire to the building. Mother Superior Catherine tried to stop them, tried to protect us. They shot her, just shot her right in front of us and left her there to die in the fire." Caleb's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, just listened. "They took 9 of us. the youngest sisters, locked us in a wagon. We didn't know where we were going. They kept us in a tobacco warehouse for 2 weeks, barely feeding us, telling us we were sinners who needed redemption through hard work and obedience. How many of you were there originally? Caleb asked. 9, Ruth said. They sold the first girl in October to a mine owner in Virginia, then another to a farmer in Tennessee, then more and more. Some of the men who bought them seemed almost decent, like maybe they really believed they were helping us. Others looked at us like we were cattle they were buying at market. By yesterday, I was the only one left. She finally took a bite of the cornbread, chewing slowly. I tried to run twice. They caught me both times and beat me for it. Today was supposed to be the last auction. After they sold me, Redemption House was going to move on to another state and start over with new girls. Caleb felt that cold anger in his chest grow colder. Where are the other 8 now? I don't know, Ruth said, and her voice cracked slightly. Scattered across 3 states, I suppose. Working for men who think they own us. Some of them might be treated well. Others, she trailed off, but Caleb could imagine what she wasn't saying. You have to understand, she continued. We weren't prepared for this. We were sheltered innocent. Most of us had never been more than 10 miles from the convent. We knew how to pray and teach children and tend gardens. We didn't know how to fight or run or survive. They picked us because we'd be easy to control. But you ran anyway, Caleb observed. Twice. A ghost of a smile crossed Ruth's face. I'm stubborn. My mother used to say I had more stubbornness than sense. Mother Superior Catherine said the same thing, though she said it fondly. I wasn't going to just accept what they were doing to us. Even if running meant getting beaten, I had to trip by him. Stubbornness isn't a sin, Caleb said. It's survival. They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling and popping as pitch in the wood ignited. Ruth finally began eating the cornbread and salt pork slowly this time, taking small bites and chewing carefully. Caleb watched the darkness beyond the firelight, listening for sounds that didn't belong. The snap of a branch, the whinny of a horse that wasn't Ash. But there was nothing except the wind in the pines and the distant call of an owl hunting in the frozen night. Then they heard it, the sound of horses moving through the forest, multiple horses, coming from the direction of the trail they'd left. Caleb was on his feet instantly, his hand on the colt at his hip. He moved to the edge of the overhang, staying in shadow, and looked down toward the creek. 4 riders moving slowly through the trees, lanterns held high, looking for something. Looking for them. Ruth had risen too, her face pale in the firelight. Is it them? She whispered. Caleb nodded. He could make out faces now in the lantern light. Preston Wakefield, his jaw still swollen from where Caleb had hit him that afternoon. And 3 rough-looking men, the kind you could hire for dirty work if you paid them enough. They hadn't spotted the campfire yet, but they would soon. The overhang concealed them somewhat, but firelight was visible from a distance in the darkness. Caleb made a quick decision. He turned to Ruth. There's a path behind this overhang that leads up to a higher ridge. Can you climb in the dark? Yes, she said without hesitation. Take Ash and go. Keep climbing until you reach the top of the ridge, then follow it north. You'll come to a larger trail eventually. Follow that trail east and it'll take you to my cabin. The door isn't locked. What about you? Ruth asked. I'm going to give them something else to think about besides chasing you. Now go, quickly and quietly. She hesitated for just a moment, long enough to look him in the eyes. Don't die, she said. I've had enough death for one lifetime. Then she was moving, leading Ash away from the firelight and up the narrow path that wound behind the rock face. Caleb waited until he couldn't hear her anymore, then turned his attention back to the men below. They were closer now, close enough that he could hear their voices. That's smoke, one of them was saying. Campfire smoke. They're up ahead somewhere. Preston's voice carried clearly in the cold air. When we find them, I want the mountain man. Nobody makes a fool of Preston Wakefield and lives to tell about it. The girl we take back to Silas. He'll handle her. Caleb felt the cold anger turn hot. He'd seen enough of men like Preston in his life. Men who thought their money or their name gave them the right to do whatever they wanted to whoever they wanted. He'd worked for men like that in the mines, been beaten by them, watched them work children to death and not care. He hadn't been able to stop them then, but he could stop this one now. He picked up a burning branch from the fire and hurled it down toward the riders. It landed in the snow with a hiss and spray of sparks, startling the horses and causing the men to pull up short. "Up here," Caleb called down to them. "You want me, Wakefield? Come and get me." There was a moment of confused shouting, then the crack of a gunshot. The bullet whined off the rock face 20 feet to Caleb's left. Nowhere close. Caleb drew his Colt, aimed carefully at the lantern Preston was holding, and fired. The lantern exploded in a spray of burning oil, and Preston's horse reared and screamed. Preston hit the ground hard, and his horse bolted back down the trail with Preston's boot still caught in the stirrup. He managed to kick free and roll into the snow, cursing loudly enough to make a sailor blush. The other 3 men had dismounted and were using their horses as cover, returning fire now. Bullets chipped at the limestone above Caleb's head, and he ducked back into better cover. He wasn't trying to kill anyone, just slow them down. Give Ruth more time to get away. He fired twice more, both shots aimed at the ground near the men's feet, sending up sprays of snow and frozen earth. They'd be more cautious now, more careful, which meant more time. "You're a dead man, Stone," Preston shouted from somewhere in the darkness. "You hear me? Dead." Caleb didn't bother responding. He ejected the spent shells from his Colt and reloaded, counting rounds in his head. He'd brought 20 rounds for the revolver, had fired 3, which left him 17. Not much if this turned into a prolonged fight. He needed to break contact and follow Ruth up the mountain. He fired once more, making them keep their heads down, then grabbed his pack and bedroll and moved quickly to the path Ruth had taken. The path was narrow and steep, more of a game trail than anything humans would normally use. It wound up through a crack in the rock, face barely wide enough for a man of Caleb's size. He had to turn sideways, in places his pack scraping against stone on both sides. Behind him, he could hear the men reaching the overhang, shouting when they found the camp empty. "Fire's still hot," one of them called. "He can't be far." "Split up," Preston ordered. "2 of you follow the trail north. Me and Cole, we go up. He's got to be going up." Caleb climbed faster, his lungs burning in the cold air. The path seemed to go on forever, winding back and forth across the rock face like a snake. Finally, after what felt like an hour, but was probably only 15 minutes, he emerged onto the higher ridge. The wind hit him like a physical force up here, strong enough to make him stagger. He could see for miles in every direction, the mountains rolling away in waves of darkness under a sky full of hard, bright stars. And there, maybe a quarter mile ahead, moving steadily north along the ridge, was a darker shadow that had to be Ruth with Ash. Caleb started after her, moving as quickly as he dared on the icy ridge. The wind covered the sound of his movement, but it also covered the sounds of anyone following him. He kept glancing back, expecting to see Preston and the one called Cole emerge from the path behind him, but there was nothing. Maybe they'd given up, decided it wasn't worth freezing to death in the mountains in December. Or maybe they were being smart, moving slowly and carefully, taking their time. Behind, back down in the valley, he could see the tiny points of light that were the searchers' lanterns moving along the creek. They'd probably follow the main trail, thinking that's where their quarry had gone. By the time they realized their mistake, Caleb and Ruth would be long gone. He caught up to Ruth about 20 minutes later. She'd stopped to let Ash rest, standing in the lee of a large boulder that gave some shelter from the wind. When she saw Caleb approaching, relief washed across her face. "You're alive," she said. "Hard to kill," Caleb replied. "How are you holding up?" "Cold," she admitted. "Tired, but I can keep going if I need to." "We need to," Caleb said. "My cabin is still about 2 hours from here, maybe 3 in the dark. But once we're there, we'll be safe for a while. It's not easy to find if you don't know where to look." They continued north along the ridge, Caleb leading Ash now, Ruth walking beside the horse to stay out of the worst of the wind. The temperature continued to drop, and Caleb's beard was soon stiff with ice from his frozen breath. His fingers were numb inside his gloves. He couldn't feel his toes anymore. Ruth had to be even colder. But she didn't complain, just kept putting one foot in front of the other with the same stubborn determination she'd shown all day. The stars wheeled slowly overhead as they walked, Orion rising in the east, the Big Dipper pointing the way north. Caleb had navigated by these stars more times than he could count in all seasons, in all weather. They were as familiar to him as old friends, more reliable than most people he'd known. After about an hour, the ridge began to descend, dropping down into a narrow valley where 3 smaller ridges came together. This was familiar territory now. Caleb knew every tree, every rock, every turn in the trail. They were close. His cabin sat in a hollow protected on three sides by steep slopes invisible from any angle until you were almost on top of it. The kind of place a man could live for years without anyone knowing he was there, which was exactly why Caleb had built it here. As they came around the last bend in the trail, the cabin appeared. A dark bulk against the snow with the two stone cairns marking the graves nearby. Caleb felt something loosen in his chest. They'd made it. He led Ash to the lean-to behind the cabin and unsaddled her, rubbing her down with handfuls of dry straw and making sure she had hay and water. The mare had earned her rest tonight. Then he and Ruth went to the cabin door. It opened with a familiar creak, and the smell of his home washed over him. Wood smoke and cured meat, and that particular scent of a place where someone has lived alone for a long time. The fire had burned down to coals in the hours since he'd left that morning, but the cabin was still warmer than outside. Caleb rekindled the fire, feeding it carefully until it blazed up again, filling the small space with light and heat. Ruth stood just inside the door, looking around at the sparse furnishings, the rough wooden table and chairs, the bed in the corner, the shelves holding his few possessions. "It's not much," Caleb said, "but it's warm and it's dry and it's safe." "It's more than I had this morning," Ruth said. "This morning I had nothing but fear and despair. Now I have this." She gestured around the cabin. "And I have hope. That's more than enough." Caleb felt something uncomfortable twist in his chest at her words. He wasn't used to gratitude, wasn't sure what to do with it. "You should sleep," he said, gesturing to the bed. "Take the bed. I'll sleep on the floor near the fire." Ruth looked like she wanted to argue, but exhaustion won out. She made her way to the bed and sat on the edge, her movements slow and careful like someone much older. Caleb turned his back to give her privacy while she removed the two large shoes and arranged herself under the blankets. When he heard the creak of the rope mattress settle, he glanced over. She was already asleep or close to it, her red hair dark against the pillow. One hand curled under her chin like a child. He spread his bedroll on the floor near the fireplace and sat down, his back against the wall, the Colt within easy reach. He should sleep too. He knew tomorrow would bring its own challenges. But he found himself unable to close his eyes, his mind too full of the day's events. The young woman sleeping in his bed, the men who would surely come looking for her. He'd broken the pattern of his life today, the careful solitude he'd maintained for 5 years. He'd let someone in, saved someone, brought them to his home. And now there would be consequences. There were always consequences. As if in answer to his thoughts, he heard it. The sound of a horse moving through the trees near the cabin. Just one horse, moving slowly like the rider was being careful not to make noise. Caleb was on his feet in an instant, Colt in hand, moving to the door. He eased it open a crack and looked out into the darkness. The horse and rider emerged from the tree line, and Caleb's finger tightened on the trigger. Then he saw the rider's face in the starlight and relaxed slightly. It wasn't Preston Wakefield or any of his men. It was a boy. Couldn't be more than 10 or 11 years old, sitting on a horse far too large for him. The boy was swaying in the saddle, clearly exhausted. As Caleb watched, the boy slid sideways and tumbled to the ground, landing in the snow with a soft thump. Caleb shoved the Colt back in its holster and ran out to where the boy had fallen. Up close, he could see that the child was in bad shape. His clothes were torn and bloody, his face pale, his breathing shallow. There was a deep gash across his forehead that had bled profusely but seemed to have stopped now. His left arm hung at an odd angle, probably broken. And there were bruises everywhere, old and new, yellow and purple and black, painting a story of repeated beatings over a long period of time. Worst of all, there were rope burns around his wrists and ankles, raw and infected. Someone had kept this child tied up. Caleb scooped the boy up, surprised by how light he was, nothing but skin and bones. He carried him quickly back to the cabin. Ruth was awake now, sitting up in bed, her eyes wide. "What happened?" she asked. "Found him outside," Caleb said, laying the boy on the table. "He's hurt bad." Together they began examining the boy's injuries in the firelight. The deep gash across his forehead, the broken left arm, the bruises everywhere, the infected rope burns. "Who could do this to a child?" Ruth whispered, her hands gentle, as she began cleaning the head wound with water Caleb heated over the fire. "Someone evil," Caleb said. He'd seen abuse before, had experienced it himself, but it never got easier to witness. He examined the broken arm carefully. It was a clean break, at least the kind that would heal if set properly. "We need to set this arm," he said to Ruth. "It's going to hurt him a lot." "I'll hold him," Ruth said. "Do what you need to do." Caleb worked quickly, feeling along the bone until he found the break, then pulling and manipulating until he felt it slip back into place. The boy screamed a high, thin sound that cut through the quiet cabin, then passed out from the pain. Caleb used strips of cloth and pieces of wood from his kindling pile to make a splint, binding it tightly. It wasn't perfect, but it would do until they could get the boy to a real doctor. They worked in silence for another hour, cleaning and bandaging wounds, making the boy as comfortable as possible. Finally, they laid him in the bed, covering him with blankets. His breathing had evened out, his face peaceful in sleep despite the injuries. "He'll live," Caleb said, "though whoever did this to him should pray we never meet." Ruth looked at the sleeping boy, then at Caleb. "This is twice in one day you've saved someone. Is this what you do, rescue people?" "No," Caleb said. "Or at least I didn't used to. I used to just live here alone and try to forget the world existed. But today, it seems like the world won't let me forget." "Maybe that's good," Ruth said softly. "Maybe you've been alone long enough." Caleb didn't have an answer for that. He stoked the fire again, adding wood to keep the cabin warm through the rest of the night. Ruth curled up in one of the chairs, refusing to take the bed now that the boy needed it. Caleb tried to argue, but she had that stubborn look in her eyes again, and he recognized a losing battle when he saw one. He spread his bedroll on the floor and lay down, his body aching from the long day. Sleep came slowly, and when it did, it brought dreams. Burning buildings, locked doors, the sound of chains rattling in darkness. He woke several times during the night, his hand reaching instinctively for his gun, but each time it was nothing. Just the wind in the trees, just the fire settling, just the normal sounds of a cabin in winter. As dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, turning it from black to gray to pale gold, Caleb lay awake and watched the light grow. In the bed the boy slept on. In the chair, Ruth was curled up with her head pillowed on her arms, her breathing deep and even. And outside, through the single window, Caleb could see the two graves marked by their cairns of stone, silent witnesses to all that had happened and all that was yet to come. He'd thought his life was finished 5 years ago when he buried Mary and Jacob, thought he was just waiting out his days until he could join them. But now, looking at the sleeping boy and the exhausted woman, he wasn't so sure anymore. Maybe there was still work to be done. Maybe there were still people who needed saving. And maybe, just maybe, saving them might save him too. The boy woke with a scream just after dawn, his eyes flying open in terror, his good arm flailing as if trying to fight off an invisible attacker. Caleb was beside him in an instant, his large hands gentle but firm on the child's shoulders, holding him still, before he could injure himself further. "Easy," Caleb said, his voice low and calm. "Easy, son, you're safe. Nobody's going to hurt you here." The boy's eyes darted around the cabin, wildly taking in the unfamiliar surroundings, the bearded giant holding him, the red-haired woman standing nearby with concern written across her features. "Where am I?" he gasped. "Where's Uncle Wesley? Is he coming? Please don't let him find me." "Nobody named Wesley is coming here," Caleb said. "You're on Ironwood Mountain in my cabin. My name is Caleb Stone. This is Miss Ruth. We found you collapsed outside last night. You were hurt pretty bad." The boy's breathing began to slow, though his eyes remained wide and frightened. Slowly, the panic seemed to drain out of him, replaced by exhaustion and pain. "My arm," he whispered. "It hurts." "It's broken," Caleb told him. "I said it best I could, but you'll need a proper doctor to look at it. Can you tell us your name?" The boy hesitated, as if even giving his name might be dangerous. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, Ben Miller. But everyone calls me Ben." "Well, Ben," Ruth said, moving closer with a cup of water. "How old are you?" "10, Ben said. "I'll be 11 in March, if I live that long." "You'll live," Caleb said with certainty. "Questions is what happened. And who's this Uncle Wesley you mentioned?" Ben's face crumpled, and tears began running down his cheeks, cutting tracks through the dirt and dried blood. "He's not really my uncle," Ben said, his voice breaking. "He's my father's brother. But Pa always said Wesley was touched by the devil." Pa was right. He had to stop, overcome by emotion. Ruth brought the water closer and helped him drink. After Pa died, Ben continued when he could speak again. Wesley came and took me from our farm, said I owed him money for Pa's debts, said I had to work for him until the debt was paid. How long ago was this? Ruth asked gently. 3 months, Ben said. Feels like 3 years. He kept me in a root cellar chained up when I wasn't working, beat me when I was too slow or when he was drunk, which was most days. Ben's next words made both Caleb and Ruth go still. Yesterday, he said he was taking me to Redemption House. Said they'd pay good money for a boy who could work. I got away when we stopped to water the horses. Stole one and just rode. Didn't know where I was going, just knew I had to get away. At the mention of Redemption House, Caleb and Ruth exchanged glances. The same people, Ruth said quietly. The same evil. You know about Redemption House? Ben asked, his eyes widening. We know, Caleb said grimly, and we know about Silas Garrett, who runs it. Ben's next words dropped like a stone into still water. But Uncle Wesley is part of it. He said his brother Silas runs Redemption House. Said they were going to make a fortune together selling kids and women nobody wants. Caleb felt something click into place. Wesley Miller, Silas Garrett, brothers, running a trafficking ring together, using different family names to avoid detection. This wasn't just business. This was family business. And that made it worse somehow, made it personal. The fire in the present-day cabin had burned low. Michael sat forward in his chair, his young face serious. Two people who needed saving, Michael said, with running from the same family. Caleb nodded slowly. That's when I understood. This wasn't one man's evil. It was a network, brothers working together. Wesley kidnapping and beating children. Silas selling them like cattle. And I had two of their victims in my cabin, a 19-year-old nun and a 10-year-old boy. Both of them broken but not beaten. He looked at his grandson. Here's the lesson, Michael. When you confront evil, you learn it doesn't travel alone. It brings friends. It builds systems. And when you stand against it, you're not just fighting one man. You're fighting everyone who profits from the suffering. What did you do? Michael asked. I made a choice, Caleb said. I could have turned them over, could have saved myself, or I could ride to Lexington and get real law involved. Real justice, even though it meant leaving them alone for 2 days while I rode for help. He paused. I chose justice. I chose to believe that doing right matters more than staying safe. And that choice, Michael, that's what determined everything that came after. Because the next morning I left Ruth and Ben in this cabin with a rifle and a prayer. And I rode harder than I'd ever ridden in my life to bring back help before the hunters found them. Caleb's eyes grew distant, but I didn't know what I'd started. Didn't know that by saving Ruth and learning about Ben, I'd kicked over a hornet's nest that would bring violence and fire and choices no man should have to make. That part of the story, that's what comes next. The fire had burned down to embers again. Outside, the first hints of dawn touched the eastern sky, turning it from black to deep blue. Michael hadn't moved from his chair in hours. His grandfather's story had held him transfixed through the entire night. They came for you, didn't they? Michael asked. The hunters. They found the cabin. Caleb shook his head slowly. No, they didn't find us. Not right away. I had 36 hours before everything exploded. 36 hours for Ruth and Ben to heal their wounds. 36 hours for me to make a plan. And 36 hours to make the hardest choice of my life. He stood from his chair, his old bones creaking, and walked to the window. The 3 graves were visible now in the growing light. 2 with names, 1 without. Sometimes doing the right thing isn't the safe thing, Michael. Sometimes to protect the weaker, the stronger has to stand up and say no further. Even if it means standing alone. Even if it means bleeding. He turned back to face his grandson. That morning, with a nun and a broken boy sleeping in my cabin, I had a choice. Stay and wait for the hunters to come. Or ride to Lexington and bring back real law, real justice. It meant leaving them alone for 2 days. 2 days when Wesley Miller or Preston Wakefield could find them. But staying meant we'd all die together when they came with enough men to overwhelm us. Caleb's eyes were distant, seeing not this warm cabin, but a frozen morning 45 years past. I chose justice. I chose to believe that the law still mattered even when the local law was corrupt. And I left them. Left Ruth with my rifle and told Ben to hide if anyone came. Then I rode Ash harder than I'd ever ridden her in her life, knowing every minute I was gone was a minute they were in danger. He sat back down the chair, creaking under his weight. And what I found in Lexington, what I learned about the evil we were fighting, that changed everything. Because it wasn't just about saving one girl and one boy anymore. It became a race against time to save a dozen lives before they were extinguished like candles. Ben tried to sit up, then gasped and fell back as pain lanced through his broken arm. "Uncle Wesley will come looking for me," Ben said, his voice tight with fear. "He always said if I ran, he'd hunt me down and kill me. Said nobody would care about one dead orphan boy." "Let him come," Caleb said, and there was steel in his voice. "If he shows his face on my mountain, he'll learn what happens to men who hurt children." Ruth brought over a bowl of porridge as she'd made from Caleb's meager supplies, sweetened with a little honey. "You need to eat," she told Ben. "Keep your strength up. You're safe here with us." Ben took the bowl with his good hand and began eating slowly, as if he expected the food to be taken away at any moment. Between bites, he studied Caleb with curiosity that was starting to overcome his fear. "You're awful big," he observed. "Are you a giant, like in the stories?" "Just a man," Caleb said. "A man who doesn't like bullies." "He saved me yesterday," Ruth added. "Saved me from the same people who were going to buy you. Your uncle was taking you to the same fate I escaped from." Ben looked at Ruth with new interest. "You were at Redemption House?" "I was going to be sold there," Ruth said. Mr. Stone stopped it. "Now we're both here, both safe, and so are you." Ben's voice held wisdom beyond his 10 years. "For how long Uncle Wesley has friends, mean friends. They'll come looking." "Then we'll be ready," Caleb said. "But first we need to get you properly healed and figure out what to do next." He stood and moved to the window, looking out at the brightening morning. The snow had stopped during the night, and the world outside was pristine and white, beautiful in the way that dangerous things often are. He could see tracks in the snow near the tree line. Deer probably come down from the high country looking for food. Beyond them, nothing. No sign of pursuit. Yet. He turned back to find Ruth watching him with those intelligent green eyes. "We can't stay here forever," she said quietly. "Can we?" "No," Caleb admitted. "This is a good place to hide for a day or two. But that's all. We need help. Real help. The law." "You said Sheriff Barton was in Silas Garrett's pocket," Ruth pointed out. "He is," Caleb agreed. "But Sheriff Jack Thornton over in Lexington isn't. Jack is a good man, honest as they come. He and I served together during the war. If anyone can help us, it's him." "Lexington is 2 days' ride from here," Ruth said. "Can you make it there and back before they find us?" "I'll have to," Caleb said. "I'll leave this morning, ride hard, and be back as quick as I can." He looked at Ben. "You'll stay here with Miss Ruth. Keep the door barred and the gun loaded. Anyone comes that you don't know, you hide in the root cellar I've got under the floorboards. Don't come out until you hear my voice. Understand?" Ben nodded solemnly. "I understand, Mr. Stone." "Just Caleb," he said. "Mr. Stone was my father, and he wasn't worth the title." He began preparing for the journey, gathering supplies, ammunition, checking Ash's hooves and tack. Ruth followed him outside, wrapping her arms around herself against the cold. "You're really going to help us," she said. "A stranger and an orphan boy you don't even know." Caleb paused in his work. "When I was Ben's age, I needed someone to help me. Nobody did. I spent 3 years in hell because nobody stepped in. I won't be nobody, not anymore." Ruth stepped closer, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her green eyes. "You're a good man, Caleb Stone. Better than you think you are." "I'm just a man who can't stand by and watch children suffer," Caleb said. "That doesn't make me good, just makes me someone who remembers." "It makes you both," Ruth said softly. Then she did something that surprised him. She stood on her toes and kissed his bearded cheek, quick and light as a bird landing. "For luck," she said. "Come back safe." Caleb felt heat rise in his face, the first time he'd blushed in years. He touched his cheek where she'd kissed him, then nodded once and swung into the saddle. "I'll be back. 2 days, 3 at most. Keep Ben safe. Keep yourself safe." He rode down the mountain as the sun climbed higher, painting in the snow with gold and shadow. The journey to Lexington would normally take 2 full days, but Caleb pushed Ash harder than he liked, stopping only when absolutely necessary to rest the mare. He traveled through country he knew well over ridges and through valleys where he'd trapped and hunted for 15 years. The land was harsh in December, but it was honest in its harshness, unlike men who smiled while they sold children into bondage. He made good time. By nightfall of the first day, he was already past the halfway point. He made a cold camp in a hollow tree, not risking a fire that might draw attention, and slept fitfully with his gun in his hand. His dreams were troubled, full of images of Ruth and Ben surrounded by armed men, the cabin burning, arriving too late to save them. He woke before dawn, fed Ash the last of the grain he'd brought, and pressed on. Lexington appeared before him as the sun reached its zenith on the second day. A proper town with brick buildings and paved streets. So different from Ashford's rough timber and mud. He'd been here before, years ago, and the sight of civilization after so long in the mountains made him feel exposed and uncomfortable. But he pushed through the discomfort and made his way to the sheriff's office on Main Street. Jack Thornton was behind his desk when Caleb walked in, and the look of surprise on his face was almost comical. "Caleb Stone," Thornton said, standing up with a grin. "As I live and breathe, I thought you'd become one with that mountain of yours by now." Caleb gripped the other man's hand. Thornton had aged in the 3 years since Caleb had last seen him. More gray in his hair, more lines around his eyes, but the grip was still firm, the eyes still sharp. "Jack," Caleb said, "I need your help." "Must be serious to bring you down from on high," Thornton said, gesturing to a chair. "Sit. Tell me everything." Caleb told him about finding Ruth at the auction, about Redemption House and Silas Garrett, about Ben showing up beaten and broken, about Wesley Miller being Silas Garrett's brother running the trafficking ring as a family business, about the men surely hunting them even now. Thornton listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker with each detail. When Caleb finished, Thornton was silent for a long moment, his jaw working as he thought. "I've heard rumors about Redemption House," Thornton said finally. "Nothing concrete enough to act on but rumors. Human trafficking dressed up as redemption and salvation. The kind of thing that makes me ashamed to call myself a lawman knowing it's happening and not being able to stop it." "Can you stop it now?" Caleb asked. Thornton stood and moved to a filing cabinet, pulling out papers and documents. "I can try. If what you're telling me is true and I have no reason to doubt you, then Silas Garrett and his operation are in violation of about a dozen laws. The trick is proving it. I'll need witnesses. I'll need evidence." "I can get you both," Caleb said. "The girl Ruth, she was there. She saw everything. And there are others. 8 more girls at Redemption House sold. If we can find them and get them to testify, that could take weeks," Thornton said. "Maybe months, and in the meantime, what happens to the girl and the boy, Garrett won't stop looking for them. If what you say is true about Sheriff Barton, then you've got the local law working against you too." "Then we need to move fast," Caleb said. "Come back to Ashford with me. Bring deputies. We raid Redemption House, free anyone they've got locked up, and arrest Garrett and his people before they can scatter." Thornton considered this, then nodded slowly. "It's risky. If we go in without proper warrants, without following procedure, any case we build could fall apart in court. But if we don't go in, more people suffer." He made his decision, the kind of decision that separated good lawmen from bad ones. "I'll get a warrant from Judge Morrison. He's sympathetic to this sort of thing. And I'll bring 4 deputies. Good men, all of them. We leave at first light tomorrow." But before Caleb could respond, a deputy burst into the office. Young man out of breath, clearly having ridden hard. "Sheriff," the deputy gasped. "Got word from an informant in Ashford. Redemption House is clearing out. Garrett's loading wagons tonight. They're leaving Kentucky tomorrow, heading to Tennessee. And sir," he hesitated, looking at Caleb, "word is Garrett plans to dispose of the girls they still have. Burn the evidence." The silence felt like a thunderclap. Caleb was on his feet. "How long?" "Informant says they're leaving at dawn," the deputy said. "That's maybe 18 hours from now." "Christ," Thornton said. "We can't get there in 18 hours. It's 2 days' ride." "Then we ride through the night," Caleb said, cold fury in his voice. "Push the horses. We can make it in 30 hours if we don't stop." "You'll kill the horses," Thornton warned. Caleb's voice was like winter. "Then we kill the horses. But we don't let those girls die." Thornton studied him, then nodded. "All right, we leave in 1 hour. I'll get the warrant and round up my deputies. But Caleb, even pushing hard, we might not make it in time. If Garrett starts early, then I go in alone if I have to, Caleb said. But I'm going. They rode out within the hour. 6 men on good horses, armed and determined. Jack Thornton and 4 deputies, plus Caleb on Ash. They pushed hard, making in one brutal stretch what had taken Caleb 2 days coming. They rode through day through night through the next morning. They stopped only to water the horses, switched to fresh mounts when they could. But Caleb stayed on Ash. He wouldn't abandon her. He could feel her straining beneath him. Knew he was pushing too hard, but there was no choice. They arrived in the hills above Ashford just as the sun reached its zenith the next day. 32 hours of riding. Men exhausted, horses blown. But there down in the valley was Ashford, and at the edge of town the tobacco warehouse, Redemption House. Smoke was rising from the building. Caleb's heart stopped. Too late. We need to scout first, Thornton said. Plan our approach, if we go in blind. But Caleb was already moving, sliding off Ash, checking his Colt, checking his Winchester. No time, Caleb said. That's smoke from inside. Garrett started already. I'm going now. Thornton grabbed his arm. Caleb, wait. We should... Caleb turned and Thornton saw something in his eyes that made him let go. I was 12 years old when I was sold to a coal mine. Caleb said, his voice quiet but carrying absolute conviction. I spent 3 years in darkness because nobody came for me. I'm not letting those girls spend one more minute in that hell. You come when you're ready. I'm going now. He left Ash with one of the deputies, took his Winchester, the Colt at his hip, and moved down the slope toward town. Behind him, he heard Thornton curse. Then, all right, men, we go in 5 minutes. Caleb Stone just made this a rescue operation. Caleb approached the warehouse through back alleys, avoiding the main street. He could smell the smoke now. Not wood smoke, chemical, deliberate. The building had 2 levels, a few small barred windows, smoke seeping from the second-floor windows. The front door was guarded by 2 men. Caleb circled to the back, found the loading dock, climbed onto the platform. The door here was locked but old. He used his knife to work the lock, slipped inside. The ground floor was mostly empty storage. The smell of smoke was stronger. He could hear sounds above, crying, shouting, and the crackling of flames. He found the stairs to the second floor, climbed quickly but quietly, Winchester ready. At the top of the stairs was a hallway with 3 doors. Smoke was pouring from the crack under the middle door. Heat building. He tried the first door, locked from the outside. He shot the lock off, burst through. Inside was an empty room, except for chains bolted to the walls, bloodstains on the floor. This was where they'd kept people. He moved to the second door. Same process. Inside, Silas Garrett himself, trying to burn papers in a fireplace, dressed in an expensive suit despite the chaos. Garrett saw Caleb, went for a gun on the desk. Caleb's voice stopped him cold. I know you. Garrett froze, looked at Caleb's face, recognition dawning, then fear. Stone, Garrett whispered. The mine boy. You're supposed to be dead. You remember, Caleb said, his voice like winter. Good. You were foreman when I was 12. You beat me for being too slow. Beat a lot of children. Some of them died. That was business, Garrett said. Just discipline. Making men out of weak boys. Where are the girls, Garrett? Garrett's smile was cruel. You're too late. Fire's already started in their room. They'll be dead in minutes. And you with them if you're stupid enough to trot on. Caleb didn't respond, just stepped forward and smashed the Winchester stock into Garrett's face. Garrett dropped unconscious. Caleb moved to the third door. Already he could feel heat through the wood. Locked. He shot the lock, kicked the door open. A wall of smoke and heat hit him. Inside the burning room, 12 girls were chained to rings in the floor. Flames were already consuming the far wall, smoke thick. The girls screaming, coughing. Caleb pulled his bandana over his face and plunged into the smoke. Used the rifle stock to break chains, one by one. The first girl, maybe 15, couldn't stand. Caleb carried her to the door, past her to deputies who'd arrived. Back into the smoke. Heat intense. He could feel his skin blistering. But he kept going. Second, third, fourth girl, all weak from starvation. Deputies forming a chain getting them out. The ceiling was starting to collapse. Burning beams falling. 5 more girls. Caleb working frantically. lungs burning, eyes streaming. Then he saw her, the last girl, youngest, maybe 14, and Silas Garrett had returned to consciousness. He was holding a knife to her throat. "Put down the gun, Stone," Garrett said, knife pressed to the girl's neck. "Or she dies right now." Caleb had his Winchester aimed at Garrett's head, but couldn't shoot. Too close to the girl, smoke getting thicker, fire spreading. The building could collapse any second. "You think you're better than me," Garrett said. "You were sold to, boy. You know how the world works. The strong survive. The weak serve. These girls are nothing without structure, without discipline, without masters to guide them." "I was nothing in that mine," Caleb said. "But I became something when I walked free. You're giving these girls the same gift. You just don't know it yet." Garrett laughed. "You're a fool, always were. Put down the gun or watch her die." A voice came from the doorway behind Garrett. "Let her go, Garrett, or learn what a convent girl can do with a Winchester." Everyone froze. Ruth stood in the smoke holding Caleb's rifle, the one he'd left with Ash. She'd followed them from the cabin, couldn't sit safe while others fought. "You won't shoot," Garrett said. "You're a nun, a servant of God." Ruth's voice was like steel. "I was a nun. Now I'm something you made me. Put down the knife." Garrett hesitated, looked between Caleb and Ruth, both armed, both ready to shoot. His mistake was glancing at Caleb for half a second. Ruth fired, not to kill, aimed low. The bullet took Garrett in the shoulder. He dropped the knife, stumbled back. The girl ran to Caleb. Caleb scooped her up and ran for the door. The building was collapsing around them. He burst through the doorway as the roof caved in, fell onto the street, gasping for air. Thornton and his deputies pulled them away from the burning building, all 12 girls safe, Garrett in handcuffs despite his shoulder wound. The building was consumed by flames. Caleb was treated for smoke inhalation, burns on his hands and arms. Ruth tended him, her face covered in soot, but eyes fierce. "You followed us," Caleb said. "I couldn't sit in that cabin, knowing you might die," Ruth replied. "You shot a man. I shot a monster. There's a difference." 3 days later, the courthouse in Ashford was packed, Judge Morrison presiding, having ridden from Lexington. One by one, the 12 girls gave testimony, describing what had been done to them, the lies they'd been told, the abuse they'd suffered. Ruth also testified, clear, strong voice, told of the convent burning, Mother Superior murdered, 9 sisters sold. Judge Morrison's face grew stern with each testimony. When the last girl finished, Morrison looked at Silas Garrett. "Mr. Garrett," the judge said, his voice cold with disgust, "you have committed crimes so heinous I can barely find words adequate to describe my revulsion. You have taken the word of God and twisted it to justify evil. You have preyed upon the innocent and the helpless. You have sold human beings as if they were cattle. The court finds you guilty on all charges and sentences you to 25 years of hard labor at the state penitentiary. May God have mercy on your soul, because this court certainly will not." The crowd erupted in applause. Garrett was led away in chains, his face finally showing fear as he realized the life he'd built on suffering was truly over. Morrison also stripped Sheriff Barton of his badge for corruption, appointed a temporary replacement. The old order was falling. Something better was rising. As the sun set that day, Caleb stood outside the courthouse with Jack Thornton. "It's done," Thornton said. "Justice served, at least for today." "What happens to the girls?" Caleb asked. "We'll try to find the others who were sold, bring them back if they want to come. These 12 will help them however we can. Some have families they can go back to. Others will figure something out." Caleb nodded. "I need to get back to my mountain. There's a young woman and a boy there who've been alone long enough." Thornton gripped his shoulder. "You did good, Caleb. Better than good. You started this. Because of you, 28 people get their lives back. I just did what anyone should have done. But you're the one who actually did it," Thornton replied. "That matters." Caleb rode through the night, on a new horse. Ash had not survived the hard ride. He'd left her with a veterinarian in Lexington, but her injuries were too severe. She died that same night, the cost of heroism. He would bury her beside Mary and Jacob, because she'd been family too. Driven by urgency, he needed to see Ruth and Ben safe. As dawn broke, he crested the last ridge and saw the cabin below. smoke rising peacefully from the chimney. Everything looked normal, safe. As he approached, the door opened. Ruth stood framed in the doorway. When she saw him, her face lit with a smile that made something warm bloom in his chest. "You came back," she said. "I said I would." Inside, Ben was sitting at the table, broken arms still splinted, but color much better. When he saw Caleb, his face brightened. "Caleb, you're back. Did you catch the bad men?" "We caught them," Caleb said. "All of them. They're going to prison for a very long time." "You're safe, Ben. Both of you are safe." Ben's eyes filled with tears. Good tears. Tears of relief. He tried to speak, couldn't get words past the emotion. Caleb crossed to him, put a hand on his shoulder. "It's all right, son. You're allowed to cry. You've earned it." Ben cried. Ruth cried with him. And even Caleb felt his eyes burning, though too stubborn to let tears fall. They sat together in that small cabin while morning light grew stronger. Three people broken by the world, starting perhaps to heal. Later, when Ben had fallen asleep from exhaustion, Ruth and Caleb sat by the fire. She'd made coffee. They drank in comfortable silence. "What happens now?" Ruth asked finally. "Now you decide," Caleb said. "Sheriff Thornton is helping the other girls find their way home or find new lives. He'll help you too if that's what you want. You could go back to the church or find your family in Ireland or do anything you choose. You're free, Ruth. Truly free." "And what do you want?" Caleb thought about it. Really thought about it. For 5 years, he'd wanted nothing except to be left alone with grief. But now, looking at this fierce young woman, looking at the boy sleeping peacefully, he realized his wants had changed. "I want you to stay," he said finally. "If you want to. No obligations, no expectations. Just stay. Help me teach Ben to read and hunt and be something other than what the world tried to make him. Help me remember what it's like to have a purpose beyond just surviving. Stay." Ruth was quiet for a long moment. Then she smiled. "I'll stay. For now, at least. I'll stay." As spring came to the mountain, as the snow melted and the world turned green, three people who had been lost found something like home. Ben healed and grew stronger. His laughter filled spaces that had been silent too long. By summer, his arm had healed, always a little crooked but functional. He could chop wood, help with hunting, do a full day's work. Ruth taught Ben to read using Caleb's small book collection. Taught Caleb to laugh again, which was harder than teaching a boy his letters. She gained back the weight she'd lost, her cheeks round and healthy. Her copper-red hair grew long enough to braid. Caleb smiled more, laughed more, lived more. They never talked about what they were to each other, this makeshift family. They didn't need to. Some things were understood without words. Ruth was not his wife, not officially, though the way she looked at him sometimes made him wonder if that might change someday. Ben was not his son by blood, but in every way that mattered, the boy was his. One evening in late June, when Ben was asleep, Caleb and Ruth sat by the fire talking about the future. Ruth asked the question that had been hanging between them. "What are we, Caleb?" "What is this?" Caleb looked at her. This fierce young woman who'd survived hell, who'd chosen to stay in his rough cabin instead of seeking comfort elsewhere. "We're what we choose to be," he said finally. "No one else's definition matters." "And what do you choose?" Caleb thought, really thought. "I choose this, you, Ben, this life. If you'll have it, if you'll have me." Ruth smiled, like sunrise. "I already chose Caleb. I chose the day I stayed." The fire in the present-day cabin was nearly out. Outside, full dawn had broken. Michael could see the three graves clearly now in the morning light. "So they stayed," Michael said. "Ruth and Ben. They became your family." Caleb nodded slowly. "For 45 years, Ruth and I married that spring. Ben grew up to be a good man, became a doctor, if you can believe it. Moved to the city, helped thousands of people." "And the three graves?" Michael asked. "Mary and Jacob, I understand. But the third one without a name?" Caleb looked out the window at the cairns of stone marked by dawn light. "Ash," he said. "My mare. She didn't survive the injuries from that hard ride to Ashford. I had to leave her in Lexington. Brought her body home after she died. Buried her beside Mary and Jacob because she was family too. She gave her life so those girls could live. That's what heroes do. Michael was quiet processing all of this. You lost everything twice, Grandpa. Wife and child the first time. Then Ruth when she passed last year. How do you keep going? Caleb turned to his grandson. This was the teaching, the wisdom that needed to be passed down. Because love, true love, isn't about never losing. It's about treasuring the time you have, even knowing it will end. Mary and Jacob taught me how to love. Ruth and Ben taught me how to love again after loss. He moved to sit beside Michael, putting a weathered hand on the boy's shoulder. And now I'm teaching you. A man isn't measured by what he holds on to, but by what he's willing to give. Not by what he gains, but by what he protects. Some people are worth bleeding for. And if you're lucky, if you're brave enough to stand when it matters, you'll find that family doesn't always come from blood. Sometimes it comes from choice. Michael looked at the graves. Thank you for sharing your story with me, Grandpa. Caleb squeezed his shoulder. It's your story now, too. Carry it. Remember it. And when your time comes to stand for someone else, and it will come, remember that your grandfather chose mercy over solitude. And that choice created everything that came after. He stood joints creaking and added wood to the dying fire. I told you at the beginning, there were 3 things I learned from this mountain. First, mercy isn't weakness. It's the hardest choice. Second, a man is measured by what he gives up, not what he keeps. Third, family comes from the choices we make in darkness. The fire caught flames rising. That winter of 1870, I made a choice. Stop a wrong I was witnessing. That choice led to another. Save a boy who needed help. That led to another. Ride for justice even when it meant risking everything. Each choice built on the last, each one harder than the one before. He looked at Michael. But you know what I learned? Every choice that mattered, every time I chose right over easy, I found myself a little less alone, a little more alive, until one day I woke up and realized I wasn't waiting to die anymore. I was living, really living, for the first time since Mary and Jacob died. The morning sun streamed through the windows, now illuminating the cabin. Dust motes danced in the light. So when you face your own darkness, Michael and you will remember this. Doing right is hard. Standing up is dangerous. Mercy costs. But staying silent, staying safe, staying alone, that costs more. It costs everything that makes life worth living. Outside a sound, horses approaching, voices calling. Caleb smiled. That'll be your parents. Come to pick you up. They'll ask what we talked about all night. Michael stood. What should I tell them? Tell them your grandfather told you a story about 3 graves. About a nun, a boy, and a mountain man who thought his life was over. About how mercy and courage and choosing right over easy can turn death into life. Michael hugged his grandfather, then headed to the door. He paused, looking back. I'll remember, Grandpa. I promise. I know you will, son. Now go. And when you're older, when you have children of your own, you tell them this story. You tell them about Ironwood Mountain, about the winter of 1870, about how one man's choice to stop a wrong he witnessed saved 28 lives, and how those lives went on to touch thousands more. Michael nodded and stepped out into the morning. Caleb stood alone in his cabin, the fire burning bright, the 3 graves visible through the window. He walked to the graves as he did every morning. But this morning was different. This morning he'd passed the story on, given it to the next generation to carry. He stood at Mary's grave first. I kept my promise, love. I lived, really lived, found joy again. But I never forgot you, never stopped loving you. Then Jacob's. Your mother would be proud of the man I became after you left, after I found my way back. Finally, the 3rd grave, the one without a name carved in stone. Thank you, old girl. You gave everything in the end, just like the rest of us. He turned back to the cabin. The sun was fully up now, a new day beginning, and Caleb Stone, 70 years old, walked back to his home, not to wait for death, but to live whatever days remain, to tend his garden, to welcome the occasional visitor who found their way to his mountain needing help, because that's what the mountain had taught him. That mercy given returns as mercy received. That courage shared multiplies. That one man standing alone can become many by simply refusing to look away when wrong is being done. The winter of 1870 had been 45 years ago, but its lessons lived on. In this cabin, in these mountains, in the story now carried by a 16-year-old boy who would tell it to his children, who would pass it down through generations yet unborn. The story of how redemption came by fire, how family was forged from strangers, how 3 graves on a mountainside marked not just death, but life, real life, hard won and dearly bought. Caleb closed the cabin door behind him. The fire burned warm, the day stretched ahead full of possibility, and on Ironwood Mountain where men once traded in souls, mercy had found a home.